concerning the plans of London and Paris to provide Kiev with nuclear weapons or with the so-called dirty bomb.
Britain has dismissed Russian claims that it plans to supply Ukraine with a nuclear weapon.
February 28, 2026. Russia's SVR, their equivalent of CIA, issues an emergency intelligence bulletin claiming British and French intelligence services are plotting to secretly help Kiev build a nuclear device. The statement doesn't say planning or considering, it says actively plotting, present tense, happening now. Here's the exact claim. Britain and France are providing technical assistance that would allow Ukraine to develop nuclear weapons using materials and expertise Ukraine doesn't currently have. This isn't about Ukraine building their own program from scratch over decades. Russia's alleged Western nations are providing shortcuts that could give Ukraine nuclear capability within months. The timing? Suspicious. Russia makes this claim the same week Britain announced the largest sanctions package since 2022. Sanctions that just cost Russia $450 billion and targeted 80% of their oil exports. Russia's oil revenue is now at its lowest point since 2020. Their economy is stagnating. Tax increases are hitting Russian citizens. And suddenly, out of nowhere, they claim Britain's doing the one thing that would justify any Russian response, no matter how extreme. Coincidence? Or desperate propaganda from a country losing an economic war? Because here's what should make you immediately skeptical. Russia's provided exactly zero evidence. No satellite imagery of suspicious facilities, no intercepted communications, no defector testimony. Just claims from an intelligence service that's been caught lying about everything from Syrian chemical weapons to Ukrainian biolabs to NATO expansion threatening Russia. But the accusation alone is dangerous, because even if it's completely false, it puts the idea into the global conversation. It creates doubt. It makes people wonder, what if there's even a small chance this is true? And that doubt is exactly what Russia wants. So let's break down what Russia's actually claiming, why they're claiming it now, and what the truth really is. Because the truth? It's way more interesting than Russia's conspiracy theory. Russia's SVR statement is specific enough to sound credible, but vague enough to be unprovable. That's intentional. Let's break down exactly what they're alleging. Claim 1. Britain and France realized Ukraine can't win militarily, so they're pursuing the nuclear option as a game changer. Russia says Western intelligence concluded that conventional weapons aren't enough to defeat Russia, so they're escalating to nuclear capability as a last resort. Claim 2. The assistance isn't whole weapons, it's technical expertise and materials. Russia claims Britain and France aren't shipping complete nuclear warheads. They're providing scientific knowledge, specialized equipment, and possibly weapons-grade fissile material that Ukraine could use to build their own devices. Claim 3. This violates Ukraine's non-nuclear status under the Budapest Memorandum. In 1994, Ukraine gave up the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal in exchange for security guarantees from Russia, US, and UK. Russia claims Britain helping Ukraine reacquire nuclear weapons breaks that agreement. Now here's where Russia's claim gets interesting. They're not saying this is a future plan. They're saying it's active right now. The SVR statement uses present tense language, implying British and French intelligence are currently engaged in this operation. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova went further. She said any efforts to help Ukraine acquire nuclear weapons are unacceptable and will be met with appropriate measures. That's the diplomatic code for "we will respond with force." And then Russia updated their nuclear doctrine. New policy. Transferring nuclear weapons to a third party is treated as equivalent to direct attack on Russia, justifying nuclear retaliation against the transferring country, not Ukraine, the country that provided the weapons. Meaning, if Britain gave Ukraine nukes and Ukraine used them, Russia's doctrine now explicitly authorizes nuclear strikes on London. That's not a theoretical future policy. That's operational doctrine Russia published specifically to deter exactly what they're claiming Britain's doing. So either Russia's creating an elaborate deterrent framework for a threat that doesn't exist, or they genuinely believe something's happening and they're trying to stop it before it's too late. But here's the problem with Russia's entire story. Ukraine doesn't need British help to build crude nuclear weapons if they really wanted to. And Britain has no strategic reason to provide that help even if Ukraine asked. Let me explain why Russia's claim falls apart under basic scrutiny. February 24, 2026. The same week, Russia accuses Britain of a nuclear plot. Britain announces the largest sanctions package against Russia since the invasion started. Not a coincidence. Here's what Britain actually hit. Transneft, Russia's state oil pipeline company that transports over 80% of Russian oil exports. That's not peripheral economic pressure. That's striking at the jugular of Russia's war funding. Oil exports are how Russia pays for missiles, tanks, ammunition, and the entire military operation. Britain just made selling that oil exponentially harder. 175 companies in the Two Rivers oil network got sanctioned. This is Russia's shadow fleet, the tankers and traders Russia uses to bypass existing sanctions and keep selling oil internationally. These ships turn off their tracking systems, falsify documents, and operate through shell companies to hide Russian origin. Britain just exposed and sanctioned the entire network in one coordinated strike. 48 individual oil tankers sanctioned by name. These specific vessels can no longer access Western financial systems, insurance, or ports. That's not symbolic. These tankers are now effectively stranded because no legitimate port will accept them and no bank will process their transactions. 9 Russian banks that process cross-border payments got cut off from international finance. These aren't random small banks. These are institutions Russia needs to conduct any international trade. Without access to these banks, Russian companies can't pay foreign suppliers or receive payment from foreign buyers. 6 entities in Russia's LNG sector got sanctioned, including specific terminals responsible for exporting liquefied natural gas to Europe and Asia. Russia's been trying to pivot from pipeline gas to LNG to maintain energy exports. Britain just made that significantly harder. Total estimated economic damage, $450 billion. For context, that's equivalent to 2 full years of Russian military spending at current levels. Britain's sanctions aren't just annoying Russia, they're potentially bankrupting the war effort. And it's working. Russia's oil revenues are at their lowest point since 2020. The Russian government has been forced to raise taxes on its own citizens, VAT increases, corporate income tax hikes, to compensate for collapsing oil income. The Russian economy, according to even pro-Kremlin analysts, has stagnated. Growth is essentially zero. Consumer prices are rising. The ruble is weakening. Britain's economic warfare is devastating Russia's ability to fund the war, and Russia has no effective counter to it. They can't sanction Britain back because the British economy doesn't depend on Russian trade. They can't retaliate militarily without triggering NATO Article 5. They can't even conduct meaningful cyber attacks without facing digital warfare that would cripple Russian infrastructure. So what does Russia do? They change the subject. They accuse Britain of the most inflammatory thing imaginable, helping Ukraine build nuclear weapons, knowing that accusation will dominate news cycles and distract from the actual story, which is that British economic pressure is slowly strangling Russia's war machine. So, Britain's sanctions are causing real, measurable damage to Russia's economy and war funding. Russia's nuclear accusations are providing zero evidence but maximum distraction. But here's where this gets really interesting. Even if Russia's claim was true, Ukraine doesn't actually need British help to build nuclear weapons, and that's the part Russia definitely doesn't want you thinking about. Here's an uncomfortable truth. If Ukraine genuinely wanted nuclear weapons and was willing to accept international isolation to get them, they probably could build crude devices without any British assistance. Let me explain why. Ukraine has nuclear expertise. They inherited Soviet nuclear infrastructure when the USSR collapsed. Ukrainian scientists operated nuclear weapons programs. They ran nuclear power plants. Technical knowledge exists in Ukraine's scientific community. This isn't theoretical. Ukraine had actual nuclear weapons on their territory until 1994, and the people who maintained them didn't all disappear. Ukraine has nuclear materials. They operate 15 nuclear reactors at 4 power plants. Those reactors contain uranium that's enriched to power generation levels, around 3 to 5% enrichment. That's not weapons grade, which requires 90% plus enrichment for uranium bombs or specific plutonium isotopes for plutonium weapons. But the base material exists. Ukraine has delivery systems, Soviet-era aircraft that could theoretically carry nuclear gravity bombs, ballistic missiles if they developed or received systems like the reported Project Nightfall. Even cruise missiles like Storm Shadow could be modified for small nuclear warheads. Delivery isn't the bottleneck, so what's actually stopping Ukraine from going nuclear on their own? 2 things: weapons-grade fissile material and international consequences. Enriching uranium from reactor-grade to weapons-grade requires specialized centrifuge cascades that Ukraine doesn't have and would take years to build. Extracting weapons-grade plutonium requires reprocessing facilities Ukraine also doesn't have. These are the actual technical barriers, not knowledge, hardware. This is where British assistance would theoretically matter. If Britain provided enriched uranium or plutonium from British stockpiles, that barrier disappears. If Britain helped Ukraine build covert enrichment capability using advanced centrifuge technology, that barrier eventually disappears. That's what Russia's alleging, not that Britain's teaching Ukraine nuclear physics, but that Britain's providing the specific materials and equipment Ukraine can't produce alone. If Ukraine used British-provided nuclear weapons against Russia, Russia's doctrine now says they can nuke London. Britain would be risking nuclear attack on British soil to give Ukraine a capability Ukraine could potentially develop on their own eventually anyway. There's no scenario where that's a rational British decision. Britain's current strategy is working. Economic sanctions are degrading Russian capability without risking British lives. Training programs are making Ukrainian forces more effective. Weapons deliveries are helping Ukraine hold territory. Why would Britain abandon a successful, low-risk strategy for a high-risk nuclear gamble that could get London vaporized? The answer is they wouldn't. Unless Russia's propaganda is so effective that we're even considering it as plausible, which means Russia's disinformation is working exactly as intended. So Ukraine could theoretically build nukes but lacks key materials, and Britain has no rational reason to provide those materials given the risks and current strategy success. Which raises the obvious question: if Russia's claim is obviously false, why make it? What does Russia actually gain from nuclear propaganda that's this transparent? And the answer reveals their entire strategy. Russia's nuclear accusation serves multiple strategic purposes simultaneously. None of them require the accusation to be true. Let me break down what Russia's actually trying to accomplish. Purpose 1: distract from economic failure. When Britain announces $450 billion in sanctions damage, that's a story about Russian weakness and British effectiveness. When Russia responds with nuclear accusations, the story becomes escalating nuclear tensions, instead of Russia's economy is collapsing. Media coverage shifts from British success to nuclear fear. That's Russia changing the narrative. Purpose 2: divide NATO and Ukraine. If Russia can convince some Europeans that Britain's recklessly escalating by considering nuclear assistance, it creates friction within the alliance. Germany might pressure Britain to be more cautious. France might distance itself from British policy. Ukraine might start doubting Western commitment if allies start arguing about what support is appropriate. Division is always Russia's goal. Purpose 3: justify future Russian actions. If Russia claims Britain's helping Ukraine build nukes, suddenly any Russian escalation looks like a defensive response rather than aggression. Russia bombing Ukrainian facilities? They're preventing nuclear weapons development. Russia striking Western logistics? They're interdicting nuclear materials. The accusation provides preemptive justification. Purpose 4. Deter actual Western escalation. Even if Britain isn't currently helping Ukraine with nuclear capability, Russia's making explicit that if Britain ever considers it, London becomes a nuclear target. That's setting red lines through public threat rather than private diplomacy. Russia's betting that making the threat public makes it more credible and therefore more effective at deterrence. Purpose 5. Domestic Russian narrative management. Russian state media is telling Russian citizens that the West is so desperate to defeat Russia that they're giving Ukraine nuclear weapons. That frames the war as existential civilizational conflict rather than Putin's choice to invade a neighbor. It justifies continued sacrifice and economic hardship to the Russian population. But here's what Russia's nuclear propaganda reveals about their actual strategic position. Russia's intelligence services are burning institutional credibility by making claims their own analysts probably know are false. And once credibility is gone, even legitimate Russian intelligence won't be believed. That's the long-term cost of propaganda that's transparent. Even though Russia's nuclear accusation is almost certainly false, it creates real strategic risks that Britain can't ignore. Risk 1. Self-fulfilling escalation spiral. Russia accuses Britain of nuclear assistance. Britain denies but continues supporting Ukraine aggressively. Russia interprets continued support as confirmation of guilt. Russia escalates based on false accusations. Britain responds to escalation. Suddenly, both sides are in conflict, driven by Russian lies that became self-fulfilling through mutual suspicion. Risk 2. Constraint on legitimate support. If Russia successfully makes helping Ukraine synonymous with nuclear escalation in public mind, Britain faces political pressure to limit even conventional support. British voters might think, if sending Storm Shadow looks like nuclear assistance to Russia, maybe we should send less. Russia constrains British policy through fear rather than facts. Risk 3. Actual nuclear proliferation concerns. Russia's accusation puts the nuclear option into global conversation. Now, Ukrainian officials are hearing arguments about whether they should build nuclear weapons. Pakistani, South Korean, and Japanese leaders are thinking about nuclear deterrence in a new context. Russia's lie might inspire actual proliferation it claims to oppose. Risk 4. NATO Article 5 ambiguity. If Russia genuinely believes Britain's helping Ukraine build nukes, or decides to act as if they believe it, and strikes British targets claiming self-defense, does NATO activate Article 5? Some members might argue Britain provoked the attack through reckless policy. Others will say an attack on a member is an attack on all, regardless of circumstance. That division could shatter the alliance. And Russia has no counter except propaganda. So Britain keeps doing what's working. More sanctions announced March 1st targeting additional Russian energy sector entities. More training, 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers through British programs already. More weapons, Storm Shadow, Challenger tanks, artillery systems. All of it legal, none of it nuclear, and all of it slowly degrading Russia's ability to sustain war. Russia screams about nuclear weapons because they can't admit the truth. They're being beaten by checkbooks and training camps. Economic warfare and professional military education aren't as dramatic as nuclear accusations, but they're winning. And that's what terrifies Russia. Russia claims Britain's building Ukraine a nuclear weapon. The truth? Britain's building something way more dangerous to Russia. An economic prison that's slowly strangling their war machine. And a professional Ukrainian military that's proving Russian forces can be beaten without any British troops fighting. $450 billion in sanctions damage. Russian oil revenue at lowest point in 6 years. 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers trained to British standards. Zero evidence of nuclear assistance because it's not happening. Russia changed the subject from "we're losing economically" to "Britain's giving Ukraine nukes," because the first story is true and terrifying while the second is false but distracting. The question isn't whether Britain's helping Ukraine build nuclear weapons. The question is whether you're going to let Russian propaganda distract you from noticing that Britain's economic warfare is working so well, Russia has to invent nuclear conspiracies to explain their failure. Russia threatened. Britain sanctioned harder. Russia's economy is collapsing. And no nuclear weapons were involved. Just British economic precision destroying Russian war funding, one tanker, one pipeline, one bank at a time. That's the truth Russia's propaganda is trying to hide. Don't let it work.